and I'm very glad to be joined this morning by the government's Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor.
There are certain things we know now, and I think we are reasonably confident that overall, probably around 1% of people who get this virus might end up dying based on the Chinese experience. Now, to be clear, what that therefore means is 99% of people will not. And if, as I think is entirely possible, a higher proportion than we currently are aware of get the infection without any symptoms, in fact, that mortality rate will go down. But let's take 1% overall as the current reasonable figure.
That a fifth of working people will be off work during the peak period. Prime Minister, what will you...
The bit of information that we don't know, there are two bits that are critical. The proportion of people who have no symptoms at all, and that's because we don't currently have tests which can work out if someone has had an infection with no symptoms at all. So it may be, for example, in China, a very large number of people have been infected with no symptoms and are not being counted in the numbers. So we don't know that. And the second thing we cannot be sure of is what proportion of the population can get infected. Now, it will not go above 80%, so for planning purposes, of course, we go up to the highest rate that it reasonably could. But in reality, my view and Patrick's view are that the proportion of the population who get infected is likely to be lower than that and probably a lot lower than that. So I think putting an overall number is largely speculative. But
to make sure that those who are ill don't also suffer hardship, particularly those on...
Oh, good.
So if you look at Wuhan, it's clearly not 80% of the population that's infected with a 1% mortality rate. And so we can learn from that this is likely to be lower than that. Of course, things could still change in Wuhan, and that could turn out to be different as they release some of the containment measures, but it's definitely a lot lower than that. And so I think what we're doing is building on the reasonable worst case scenario, which is the one that Chris has laid out for planning purposes, which is the appropriate thing to do, and then looking very carefully at how this evolves and what the numbers might turn out to be.
Yes, sorry.
In terms of moving from containment to delay, the first point to make is that most of the things that we do to try and help contain the virus, like finding the early cases and isolating them, also are very important for delay. So they serve both purposes. There will come a point potentially, and not definitely, but there will come a point potentially where the amount of transmission either in the UK or, equally likely, everywhere in the world is so great that actually the idea of containing, which is to say essentially getting rid of this virus completely, ceases to make sense. We have not reached that point, but we could reach that point. And at that point, we will move over to saying, well, that bit has stopped. But to be clear, many of the things we're currently doing will continue because they also have a role in delay.
To make sure that those who are ill don't also suffer hardship, particularly those on...
If the virus moves into the kind of stages that our scientific advisors have just been talking about, it will be very important for everybody to think not only what we can do to prevent the spread of the virus individually, but also what we can do to avoid too much pressure on the NHS. So when it comes to using services such as GPs or 111, and it will be quite important to be self-restraining where possible, because as I say, most people will unquestionably get through it. And on your second point about the police and the army and back, there are long-established plans by which the police will, obviously they will keep the public safe, but they will prioritise those things that they have to do, and the army is of course always ready to backfill as and when, but that is under the reasonable worst case scenario. Thanks everybody. Thank you.